So I'm Kristen Robbins, Chair of the House Fraud Prevention and State Agency Oversight Committee, and we are here to talk about the majority report that was passed out of the Fraud Prevention Committee on Wednesday. We moved the hearing, Wednesday. And then how it works in an oversight committee is that the majority produces a report, and then under our committee rules, the minority has 48 hours to produce a minority report. And we were notified yesterday by the minority lead Pinto that they would not be producing a minority report. And then today at 12:15, they did send us a statement, which may or may not, they may have provided to you, I'm not sure. But so I just want to go through our majority report and answer any questions you have, because I think it's so important for the 2 years of work of our committee for the public to understand what was uncovered and what the roadmap is for going forward. So as I said in a very first press conference when the committee was created back in February of 2025, fraud is not a partisan issue. And we still believe that, and I think the public believes that. And the 3 goals we set out for the committee were to expose fraud, to close gaps and strengthen internal controls, and then to create a place for whistleblowers to report incidents of fraud. Because we had started hearing just anecdotally and through email from whistleblowers, so we created the portal mnfraud.com, which still exists, which opened up the floodgates for fraud reports. And so that was an important part of our work that led to a lot of the tips that led to the different vectors of fraud that we uncovered. And that portal will stay open even once we adjourn until the next legislative session. And we will, with our staff, continue to monitor that and dig into any reports we get over the interim. So the first thing the report sort of helps us understand is how Minnesota became the epicenter of fraud. And what we discovered looking back at historical OLA reports, reports from whistleblowers, is that it really started with CCAP, the Child Care Assistance Program. Back early reports from 2011 and then through 2013 and up to 2018, that was the first major vector of fraud, and it morphed into Feeding Our Future. A lot of the people that were involved in the original CCAP fraud then became Feeding Our Future sites. And once they got into the Feeding Our Future vector, then that opened the floodgates because they had sort of perfected the model. And that led to fraud in integrated community supports, housing stabilization, sober homes, autism centers, adult daycare, assisted living, non-emergency medical transportation, interpretive services. So if we would have stopped the fraud that was known in the CCAP years, we might not have had this incredible explosion of fraud in all these other Medicaid waivered services program. And so understanding that history and understanding how it kept being allowed and enabled, and in some cases reports of fraud suppressed or covered up, that created this culture where fraud was tolerated and where whistleblowers were retaliated against. And that culture is what allowed this incredible explosion of fraud throughout state government, particularly in the DHS space, but there were other areas too. CCAP is actually a different funding area, now is run by DCYF, and the Feeding Our Future scandal came through Minnesota Department of Education. So understanding that history led to our findings. And if you look at the report, it's very robust. So we not only chronicle what happened, but in each area of fraud, we talk about findings. And then we had a very robust section of recommendations. How do we move forward? And we've done a lot of great work, bipartisan work, on strengthening internal controls, strengthening whistleblower protections, creating fraud notes. So we've, through the work on our committee, then passed many other excellent bills that can help stop the fraud through the agencies. but there's more work to do, and we lay that out in our recommendation section. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues from the Fraud Committee and let them talk about some specific areas of the fraud that they worked on or wanted to highlight. And I also want to acknowledge that we also at one point had Representative Marion Rarick on the committee, Representative Walter Hudson. They also contributed greatly to this work. So with that, I'll turn it over. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Robbins. And I am a Representative P.M. Altendorf from District 20A. I joined the Fraud Committee later, and excuse me, today's report is about this 84-page majority report that the Republicans have submitted to the public. This is available online. I think it's very important for Minnesotans to read this. Exposure is good. Sunlight is the disinfectant that we need here in Minnesota to fraud. In this 84-page report, it is well documented, and Minnesotans, please look at it, but also I want to encourage you to thank Chair Robbins, the staff, everyone who has worked diligently, the whistleblowers who have worked diligently to expose this, because this is exactly what we needed to happen. And seeing this on the inside, the amount of time that it took to interview people, the coordination, the effort, the organization, it was really quite incredible to see. Minnesotans deserve the fraud to be exposed. And this is the step that we need in order for us to get to the next step. Minnesotans expect us as legislators to govern in a way to make sure that we are protecting Minnesota's tax dollars. It was quoted by the U.S. Attorney Joe Thompson. He said, "We could not prosecute our way out of this fraud." That is how much fraud is in this state. And if you go outside of the state, if you have friends or relatives outside of the state, the fraud in Minnesota is well known nationwide. It's embarrassing. And I want to be a part of those solutions. Just to give you one example of something that the Fraud Committee worked on, the Housing Stabilization Services. This was a Medicaid funding program to help people with disabilities, to move them from being homelessness into some sort of permanent housing. Minnesota, we were an outlier on this. We were the first state in the country to have a program like this. And the first expectations when this passed into law was an estimate of a mere $2.6 million. Well, that exploded over a 4-year period to a $105 million program. And this is just one example of that we are not doing good governance here in Minnesota. To see those kind of numbers escalate, there should have been red flags all over for people, for Wells, for the everyone within the legislature to do that. But this program was, Carol Levin did a report that was great in May. We had FBI raids in July of 2025. And we know that this is a very fraudulent program because the numbers dropped just by this exposure. In 2025, the number was down to 57 million. So folks, this is not unique into this program. It's across the board in all these programs. There's a phantom, no-show billing, forged falsified documents, kickback schemes, retaliating against whistleblowers, and all of it should not be tolerated here in the state of Minnesota. I know the Democrat Party is somewhat trying to deflect. I know that they are embarrassed by the amount of fraud that has happened under this state. But Minnesota deserves answers, and that's what this fraud committee did. This fraud committee will, when we look back in history, will be the pinpoint of what turned the state of Minnesota, I believe, into a better governing state, bringing back accountability, and making sure this doesn't happen again. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Altendorf. My name is Isaac Schultz. I'm the state representative for District 10B and have had the great pleasure of serving alongside the other members of the Fraud Committee since its beginning. And I just have to, again, thank Chair Robbins and her incredible work, as well as the other members of the committee who truly dug in. And I think when I look back over these last 2 years of watching what has transpired and what this committee has been able to unearth, it's that that specific industrial scale fraud that Joe Thompson talked about is so real, and no one prior to this committee at the state capitol was doing anything about it that was meaningful and tangible to stop the flow of our tax dollars to fraudsters. Much of that money has landed in overseas countries and in Eastern Africa, and Minnesotans demand accountability, and they expect better from government. And when we look back at these years of the fraud committee, we'll look back and see that this was a failure of leadership, of accountability, and the culture problems that existed while Tim Walz was the governor of Minnesota. That's what we will look back and see. No additional law had to be passed. It just meant state agencies and commissioners and the governor having accountability and doing the role that the executive branch is tasked with doing by the Constitution to protect the taxpayers' money. And they're beyond the outright failure of that role. We have now been able to shine a light to all of the different problems that have existed and to bring more coordination. And this is where Chair Robbins deserves so much credit. While law enforcement agencies from the FBI and the BCA have investigated at different times on different specific instances, this is the first time that the whole web was able to be delivered to Minnesotans in a way where they could see the vast nature of fraud in our state, from the Medicaid-funded programs, the 14 high-risk programs, to the story of Feeding Our Future, that up to $500 million worth of fraud, and how it happened, who was involved, and how those same actors are people who have stolen from our Medicaid-funded programs in the years since 2021. And this never had to happen. And we had the tools in place to hold these people accountable, to stop the payments, and yet the Walz administration decided to allow these payments to continue to convicted fraudsters, to these programs that saw massive increases. It was as if someone was asleep at the wheel. But it goes beyond that. What we saw in this committee was that it had to go beyond what someone may have missed and be something that was directly and specifically done for the purposes of benefiting someone. And when we look back here, it's just this failure of oversight overall, which speaks to why this committee was important for the future of Minnesota. Oversight is important. And while every given legislative committee carries a responsibility over their own jurisdiction, it's true that we as the legislature are focused on crafting bills and legislation, and that means that at times we don't spend the time that needs to be spent on holding agencies accountable, which is exactly what this committee sought to do, to shine that light. So I'm excited that we were able to, on a bipartisan fashion during this session, and during 2025 and 2026, be able to pass good bipartisan pieces of legislation, some of which are reaching the governor's desk this week, some of which will be signed into law next week. And those are things that we can highlight as things that are going to set the stage for the future of Minnesota. And I know there's one giant one that we're super excited for, and I know that Representative Anderson is going to share a little bit about that next.
Thank you, Representative Schultz and Chair Robbins. And Chair Robbins, thank you for your leadership. So it was, you did a fantastic job. So when I got back in the legislature a couple of years ago, it was 4 years ago, it was during the trifecta, I was put on the audit commission. And I am, as you know, the former state auditor from years ago. I'm also a former commissioner. And so I served under the Plenty administration. And the reports that we were hearing out of the audit commission were just incredible. Things that it was very just unbelievable to me that that's what was actually going on. And I felt for Judy Randall. You know, she would do these reports. She was getting pushback from legislators on the other side of the aisle. I know that there was a point in time in 2019 when Melissa Hortman had actually said that her reports won't be heard in any committee. And you had people like her who were trying to bring to light things that were happening. But all they could do really is do a report, bring it to light, but they couldn't actually do anything about it. Then 2 years ago, this commission was formed. And this commission built on that work and actually dug in, brought in commissioners, brought in whistleblowers, brought in people from across the state and people that were on the inside to actually show what was really, really going on and exposed this fraud. And that's what we've had for the last 2 years. And because of it, we have recognition by, I think, everyone, both parties. I think the governor's office, I think certainly nationally, we are the epicenter of fraud. And we have recognition of that what has been going on is bad. What's been going on is horrible. It is $9 billion down the drain, and very few people have been held accountable. And no one in state government that I know of so far. No one. So that's what this commission has done. I want a very quick example of the autism service, one of the 14 programs. We had a hearing in February. That hearing, as you know, it was put under high risk. Then they started doing very, very basic licensing, like do you have do you actually have a storefront? Do you actually have one person who's medical? Very basic. And only 20%, I think at the time, had even signed up for licensing. I think that deadline is the end of this month, and I would encourage the press to actually ask and find out what percent of former autism centers, I think it were 800 originally, what percent actually just kind of went away when we started actually licensing, basic licensing, these autism centers. You had a 4-fold increase in spending in that program in just 4 years. 4-fold, that's insane. And I'll go briefly back to my time as auditor and my time as a commissioner. There is no way that this wasn't known, that there was a huge problem. When you have explosive numbers like this in programs, especially programs that have no oversight, everyone knows. Everyone knows there's something going on, all the way up to the governor's office. And there is no way that the whistleblowers who went all the way up through the commissioners, through the OIGs and the agencies who are not independent, and all the way to the governor's office, and they were shut down. They were absolutely shut down. This is horrible what's happened to the state. And sometimes you have, there's a need for a balance of power, right? We have 3 branches of government. One thing the legislative branch did, and it was our House File 1 originally, House Republicans, is we passed this Office of Inspector General bill. Because sometimes, unfortunately, you need an outside independent entity to be responsible and overlook the executive branch. And that's what this has done, and that's what we've created. And my understanding is the governor signed that yesterday. So that's a huge, huge win for Minnesotans. So I'm sad about this. I'm sad about what's happened to the state. I'm leaving. I'm not running again. I think you're aware of that. And I hope that future legislators, a future governor, can turn this around, and that we can get back Minnesota's reputation, or at least not be known worldwide as the culture, the state filled with fraud. So thank you. I'll turn it back to Representative Robbins, Chair Robbins.
Thanks. So with that, we're happy to take questions about the report, about any other issues regarding the Fraud Committee.
Do you feel helpful that now that there is an Office of Inspector General, when does that go into effect?
Thank you, yeah. Chair Robbins. The Inspector General will go into effect in January. So yeah, so the process is that there'll be a commission set up this fall, a commission that will interview and choose those folks. It's bipartisan, so 2 from each chamber, so 8 total. They will interview candidates, and then they will make a recommendation to the next governor, who will then hopefully choose one of those folks, but they will need a 3/5 vote in the Senate. So it will be completely bipartisan.
Can I just ask, you feel, I mean, it sounds like you feel like the result of the Office of Inspector General, some of the changes in laws that have been made, I mean, is it setting Minnesota up for a different course on this?
Thank you, absolutely. These are things that the next governor, no matter who that is, we have passed things this session that will put into place the ability of that next governor to make significant changes. And with the Inspector General, that Inspector General's office will make sure that that's happening because they have significant authority. They have authority to look at any public dollar, any public program, any recipient of public dollars, any vendor of public dollars. They have complete authority. It's a very strong Inspector General. I know that there's dollars in the budget deal that was cut. There are dollars that are going into IT across the counties and the state. That has to get done. It's ridiculous that it hasn't been. And you can solve a lot of this with that. But there are other things that were in O'Malley's report, which I think was an excellent, excellent report that didn't get into statute. And I think we just sort of ran out of time. I'll be honest, I was waiting for, I was working on the OIG bill and other things, and many members up here have other fraud things that have passed. And I was waiting for the governor's fraud bill. It never showed up. It never showed up. We were just waiting for that to be drafted. I kept asking Lead Pinto, where's the governor's fraud bill after the O'Malley report? There's none. Okay, so there are things in that O'Malley report that need to happen, like one of his big recommendations that I think would solve a lot of problems is that vendors in these programs need to have records on site accessible at all times by the overseers, by whether it's DHS or the Office of Inspector General. That didn't get in there. That is really important, really, really, really important. But other things did get in there. We're going to have site visits. We're going to, just the OIG bill alone, part of the fiscal note on that, which I wasn't real fan of, but we took it, right, is the DHS said that they need 35 new people in their oversight division. So there's that $5 million line in that fiscal note that looks like it's for the Inspector General, but it's really for DHS. They said just the nature of having an Inspector General, they expect the whistleblowing and the calls to come in to significantly expand, okay? And I think they're actually right.
What about your small market, small government Republicans? Aren't you kind of growing government here, which would not be the typical Republican response?
It is certainly not our intention to grow government. Our intention is to get government under control. And we absolutely have to do that. The Independent Office of Inspector General will help that. But one of the things that we highlight in our report and that former Judge O'Malley highlighted in his report is that it fundamentally comes down to a culture change. And the Walz administration has refused to hold any of its commissioners or employees or itself accountable. So the number one thing the next governor can do is change the culture and have a no fraud, no excuses culture, and back that up by firing people who tolerate fraud. And if we change the culture in the agencies and the expectation, that will go a long way to stopping the fraud. And if we need these temporary increases, which I'm not a fan of for DHS, they have plenty of employees, they should redirect people in my mind. But I do think right now the whistleblowers have no confidence in going to DHS or to the Attorney General's office. That's why we created the whistleblower portal, mnfraud.com. And they came out of the woodwork. We cannot keep up with the whistleblower reports. We are still investigating things that come in every week. And so I'm assuming that that will start happening in the agencies when people feel more confident that their reports are being taken seriously when the Inspector General is in place.
Did you establish a motive why the Democrats or the governor ignored this or inaction, I guess, as you might say?
I would be stronger than inaction. I think we said enabled and were malfeasant.
What was the motive?
I think the motive was probably twofold. My understanding from a lot of whistleblowers is that when they tried to point this out, they were told that they should not be rocking the boat because they would be labeled as racist or Islamophobic. And as I've said many times, as far as we know, to date, a lot of the fraud did occur in the Somali community. But some of our best whistleblowers are in the Somali community. Fraud is fraud. It doesn't matter who's committing it, but when there was this sense that, oh, we can't talk about it because it's happening in the Somali community and that will hurt us politically, which is what whistleblowers have said, that was part of the reason it was allowed to continue, because people were afraid of hurting their political base. And we have got to change the culture so that we're not afraid to say the truth in Minnesota. Wherever there is fraud, we need to call it out, no matter who's committing it, and it needs to be prosecuted, and agencies need to be held accountable. Fraud is fraud. It doesn't matter where it's coming from. We need to stop it. We need to have rule of law. We need to enforce accountability in these programs, protect taxpayers, and protect the vulnerable citizens who are denied services or harmed when these programs are fraudulent.
One more from me, Representative Anderson. Let's say the OIG gives a recommendation or makes a ruling. Does it go to court? Does it go to the legislature? What happens once he finds or she finds fraud? What happens then?
It depends on what it is, obviously, so recommendation or ruling or, but if the Inspector General finds fraud, the Inspector General goes after that. The Inspector General has full authority to investigate, a year later will have full police powers to arrest, and it will be prosecuted. They will have those full powers. In the short term, between January of '27 and January of '28, while they're setting up, this is going to take a little time, right, to set up. We have to hire the OIG. We've got to get their staff, bring the MDE staff over. He's got to staff up. And then the police powers come in January of '28. In that short term, the Inspector General can have agreements with any number of law enforcement entities to do that law enforcement piece. Okay, that could be the BCA, that could be the county, that could be a city, that could be whatever the Inspector General thinks is appropriate. But they will be able to investigate. They don't need to come to us. They don't need to go to the governor. They don't need to go to a commissioner. Nobody. So, and that's what the difference. So right now we have Inspector Generals in a few agencies, right? So, but we know, absolutely know from tons of whistleblowing and OLA reports and everything else, these Inspector Generals in the agencies answer to the commissioners and the governors. They are not independent, and they have, in many, many, many cases, they have been, their findings have been suppressed, and they've been told, not to do this. We absolutely know that. It's real. That's what's so sad, Eric, is that this is very real, this fraud.
Do any of the bills enumerate a salary for the Inspector General?
We got an email this morning. We're at it'll be a provision, we missed it, added into the state gov bill tomorrow. It will be set by the LCs, the commission that sets salaries. So, yeah, that acronym. So that will be added in there. Thank you.
Anybody else? Great. Thank you for coming.